Grief is a ghost that lives in the heart, a constant, silent companion that reshapes the world into a landscape of memories and what-ifs. For Park Jae-wook, the world had become a monochromatic canvas of loss, each dawn a stark reminder of the son he had buried. At 36, he was a man carved from marble, handsome in a severe, unyielding way that complemented the empire of shadows he commanded. His suits were as dark as his moods, his words as precise and cutting as the winter wind that whipped across the polished granite of the cemetery. He stood before the small, elegant headstone, a solitary figure against the weeping gray sky. The name etched into the stone, Min-ho, was a wound that would not close. Rain began to fall, slicking the emerald grass and tracing silver paths down the carved letters of his son's name. It was in this private sanctuary of sorrow that he first saw her, a vibrant disruption to his world of gray. She was a young African woman, her beauty as striking as it was out of place in this quiet corner of Seoul. She knelt before his son's grave, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, her hands clutching a small, worn teddy bear. Her presence was an anomaly, a question mark hanging in the rain-soaked air. Jae-wook's grief, a possessive and jealous thing, recoiled at the sight of this stranger sharing a sorrow that he considered his alone. Who was she? Why did she weep for his son with a pain that so clearly mirrored his own? The questions were a sudden, sharp intrusion into the dull ache of his existence, pulling him from the depths of his mourning and into the sharp focus of a mystery he was compelled to solve. His hand instinctively went to the inside of his jacket, the cold metal of the pistol he always carried a familiar, grounding weight. He began to walk toward her, each step a deliberate, measured beat in the rhythm of the falling rain, the powerful Mafia boss moving toward the one person who might hold the key to the secrets surrounding his son's death, or who might be a new, unforeseen threat in a life already defined by them. The soft squelch of his expensive leather shoes on the wet grass made her flinch. She looked up, her large, expressive eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. Tears stained her dark cheeks, yet her gaze was direct, unwavering. Jae-wook stopped a few feet from her, his tall frame casting a long shadow, even in the dim light. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and devoid of warmth, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing within him. "Who are you?" he asked, the question hanging between them, sharp and cold. The woman, whose name was Nia, didn't answer immediately. She rose to her feet with a fluid grace, clutching the teddy bear to her chest, as if it were a shield. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her voice soft but laced with an unexpected strength. Her Korean was flawless, which only deepened the enigma she presented. Jae-wook's eyes narrowed. He was not a man accustomed to being challenged, especially not in a place so sacred to his pain. "This is my son's grave," he stated, the words heavy with ownership. "So, I will ask again. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Nia's gaze flickered to the headstone, a fresh wave of sorrow washing over her features. I knew him," she whispered, the confession a fragile thing in the tense air. This was not the answer he expected. His son's life had been a carefully curated existence, insulated by wealth and power, his friends and acquaintances all known, all vetted. This woman was not part of that world. The incongruity of her presence ignited his suspicion, a cold flame that burned away the edges of his grief. He signaled to his loyal enforcer, Min-joon, who had been standing stoically by the car. Min-joon, ever vigilant, approached, his eyes never leaving Nia. "Find out who she is," Jae-wook commanded, his voice a low growl. "I want to know everything. Where she lives, who she talks to, and why she is crying at my son's grave." Nia watched the exchange, her fear now mingled with a spark of anger. "You can't just investigate me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I have a right to be here." Jae-wook took a step closer, invading her space, his presence overwhelming. "You have no rights here," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Not until I know why your tears are falling on my son's final resting place." Back in the sterile quiet of his penthouse, the city lights of Seoul glittering like a sea of distant, indifferent stars, Jae-wook found no peace. The image of the woman, Nia, was seared into his mind, her defiant, grief-stricken face a stark contrast to the muted tones of his life. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to dull the sharp edges of his thoughts. His son, Minho, had been his world, the one pure, untainted thing in his life of violence and secrets. The official report had called his death a tragic accident, a hit-and run by a driver who was never found. But Jae-wook had always harbored a cold certainty that it was no accident. It was a message, a carefully orchestrated act of war from one of his many unseen enemies. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in his chest. He had built a fortress of power to protect his son, but it had become a golden cage, and ultimately it had failed. He had been so consumed by his empire that he had missed the signs, the subtle shifts in the currents of his dangerous world. Now, this woman had appeared, a ghost from a life his son had seemingly lived in secret. Was she a threat? A pawn in a larger game? Or was she, like him, just another victim of the tragedy that had shattered his world? Minjun's initial report arrived in a sleek, encrypted file. The findings were maddeningly mundane. Nia Adebayo, 28 years old, a recent immigrant from Nigeria, worked as a freelance translator. She lived in a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood, had no criminal record, and no discernible ties to any of Jae-wook's rivals. She was, for all intents and purposes, an ordinary woman. But ordinary women did not weep at the graves of Mafia bosses' sons. The lack of information was more damning than any incriminating evidence. It meant she was either incredibly adept at hiding her tracks, or her connection to Minho was something deeply personal, something that existed outside the realm of his criminal enterprise. The mystery of her nod at him, a welcome distraction from the hollow ache of his loss. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something other than grief, a burning, relentless curiosity. He had to see her again, had to force the truth from her, one way or another. He found her at a small, independent bookstore, a place so removed from his own world that it felt like stepping into another dimension. The air smelled of old paper and fresh coffee, a gentle quietude filling the space. Nia was seated at a small table, a book open in front of her, but she wasn't reading. She was staring out the window, her expression lost and distant. This time, Jae-wook approached her without the intimidating presence of his enforcer. He sat down opposite her, his sudden appearance making her jump. Her eyes, when they met his, were guarded, wary. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, a command disguised as a request. Nia closed her book, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "I have nothing to say to you," she replied, her tone cool, a stark contrast to the emotional woman he had seen at the cemetery. "I know who you are, Park Jae-wook. I know what you do. I want no part of it." Her knowledge of him was another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. "And yet, you were at my son's grave," he countered, leaning forward, his intensity a palpable force. "You cried for him. You knew him. Tell me how." A flicker of pain crossed her face, a brief, unguarded moment that he did not miss. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It won't bring him back." Jae-wook felt a surge of frustration, but he suppressed it, opting for a different tactic. He softened his voice, a rare and calculated move. "Please," he said, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "If you knew him, then you know how much he meant to me. His death, it was not an accident. I need to know the truth. If you cared for him at all, you will help me." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the battle between her fear of him and her grief for Minho. It was this shared sorrow, this common ground of loss, that began to forge a strange, unwilling connection between them. There, in the quiet sanctuary of the bookstore, the cold, ruthless mafia boss and the mysterious, grieving woman found themselves bound by the ghost of a boy they had both loved. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with the nascent, dangerous possibility of a trust that neither of them could afford. Nia finally broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. but firm. "I was his tutor," she said, the simple words landing with the force of a physical blow. "I taught him English twice a week for the last year of his life." The revelation was both a relief and a source of a dozen new questions. A tutor. It was so simple, so normal, and yet it explained nothing. Why the secrecy? Why had Minho, who was fluent in English, needed a tutor? "He told me not to tell you," Nia continued, sensing his confusion. "He said you wouldn't approve. He wanted something that was just his, away from your world." Jae-wook felt a pang of guilt, sharp and familiar. His son had been trying to carve out a piece of a normal life for himself, and he had been too blind to see it. "The teddy bear," he said, the image of her clutching it at the grave flashing in his mind. "It was his, wasn't it?" She nodded, a fresh tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It was the first gift I ever gave him. He took it with him everywhere." Her voice broke on the last word, and in that moment, Jae-wook saw not a stranger, but a fellow mourner, a young woman whose heart had been broken by the same tragedy that had shattered his own. He felt an unfamiliar urge to comfort her, a pull toward her that was both confusing and undeniable. But before he could act on it, Nia's expression hardened, a new resolve setting in her eyes. "There's more," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The day he died, he was supposed to meet me. He called me." He sounded scared. "He said he had found out something about your business, something terrible. He said your brother, Park Jin-woo, was involved." The name hit Jae-wook like a punch to the gut. Jin-woo, his own flesh and blood, his right-hand man, the one person he thought he could trust implicitly, the traitor from within. The possibility was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that he almost dismissed it. But then he saw the conviction in Nia's eyes, the raw, unadulterated truth of her fear. She pulled a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket and slid it across the table. "He gave this to me for safekeeping," she said. "He told me if anything happened to him, I should give it to you." Jae-wook unfolded the paper, his hands unsteady. It was a list of offshore account numbers, and at the bottom, a single, damning name, Park Jin-woo. The world tilted on its axis, the quiet bookstore fading into a blur as the terrible truth began to dawn. His son had not been the victim of a random act of violence. He had been silenced, and the order had come from within his own family. The revelation struck Jae-wook with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Jin-woo, his own brother, the foundation of his world, already fractured by grief, now crumbled into dust. The betrayal was a venom that spread through him, hot and suffocating, eclipsing even his sorrow with a pure, unadulterated rage. He looked at Nia, at the terrified truth in her eyes, and knew in that instant that her life was in as much danger as his son's had been. His world, a carefully constructed labyrinth of power and violence, had a new center: her. Protecting her was no longer a strategic necessity to uncover the truth. It was a primal, undeniable imperative. He stood, his movements sharp and decisive. "You are not safe," he stated, the words an ironclad fact. "You will come with me." There was no room for argument in his tone. He escorted her from the bookstore, his hand of firm, proprietary presence on the small of her back, guiding her into the back of his armored sedan. The quiet intimacy of the bookstore was shattered, replaced by the sterile luxury of his world. They sped through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, the city a blur of neon and shadow. Nia remained silent, clutching the small piece of paper as if it were the last tangible piece of Minho she had left. In the oppressive quiet of the car, a strange connection began to form. They were two poles of a tragedy, a powerful crime lord and an ordinary woman, now bound together by a secret that could destroy them both. He took her to his penthouse, a sterile fortress in the sky, all glass and steel and cold, minimalist furniture. It was a reflection of the man himself, powerful, isolated, and devoid of warmth. From here, the city was a silent, glittering carpet below, a world away from the storm brewing within those walls. He watched her as she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a small, fragile figure silhouetted against the vastness of the city. He saw not just a witness, but the last person who had seen his son's light, his hidden joy. An unfamiliar softness crept into his heart, a protective instinct so fierce it startled him. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. "He must have trusted you a great deal," Jae-wook said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Nia turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "He just wanted to be a normal kid," she whispered. "He loved you, but he was scared of this life." The words were a knife to his soul, twisting the guilt that was his constant companion. He had given his son everything except the one thing he truly wanted, freedom. And in the end, his world had swallowed his son whole. He felt an undeniable pull toward her, a shared understanding that transcended words. In her, he saw his son's goodness, and in him, she saw the depths of a father's broken heart. The penthouse, designed to be an impenetrable fortress, soon felt like a cage. For Nia, it was a world of gilded terror, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a jolt to her frayed nerves. For Jae-wook, her presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of everything he had lost and everything he now stood to lose again. He assigned Minjun to be her constant shadow, a silent, formidable guardian. But it was Jae-wook himself who found his orbits constantly shifting to include her. He would find her in the library, surrounded by books that had belonged to his son, her fingers tracing the titles as if trying to conjure his memory. He'd watch her from his office, a turmoil of emotions warring within him. He was drawn to her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of a world that should have broken her. The investigation into Jinwoo was a silent, deadly current running beneath the surface of their strange domesticity. Jae-wook moved with lethal precision, his grief channeled into a cold, methodical pursuit of vengeance. He leveraged his network, his loyal enforcer Minjun gathering whispers and digital ghosts that began to form a damning portrait of his brother's treachery. Jinwoo, sensing the shift in the air, grew desperate. He knew Jae-wook's grief would eventually sharpen into suspicion, and he knew Nia was the key. He unleashed the ghost from Jae-wook's past, a brutal enforcer named Kong, a man Jae-wook had crippled and disgraced years ago. Kong, driven by a raw, festering hatred, was the perfect instrument of chaos. The attack came without warning. It was swift and brutal. Kong and his men breached the penthouse's security, a violent storm tearing through the sterile calm. Minjun moved to intercept them, a blur of disciplined violence, but they were outnumbered. The sound of gunfire echoed through the vast apartment. Jae-wook, who was in his study, reacted instantly, his rage a white-hot inferno. But his first thought was not of the fight, not of the betrayal, but of her. He ran to the library, where he found Nia cornered by Kong, his scarred face twisted in a predatory grin. In that moment, Jae-wook's world narrowed to a single point, the man threatening the woman who had become the anchor for his unmoored soul. He didn't hesitate. The ensuing fight was primal, a clash of past and present, of old hatreds and a new, desperate love. Jae-wook moved with a ferocity that even Kong was unprepared for, his movements not those of a calculating boss, but of an animal defending its mate. He shielded Nia with his own body, taking a deep gash on his arm meant for her, the pain a distant echo to the roaring in his ears. He would not fail again. He would not lose someone else he cared for to the darkness of his world. In the aftermath of the failed attack, the penthouse was a landscape of shattered glass and splintered wood, the silence thick with the metallic scent of blood and fear. Kong and his men were gone, either subdued or having fled, but the violation lingered in the air. Jae-wook stood over Nia, his chest heaving, his arm bleeding freely onto the expensive rug. The cold mask of the Mafia boss had been obliterated, replaced by the raw, unguarded face of a man terrified of loss. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he brushed a stray piece of glass from her hair. The touch was electric, a silent communication that spoke volumes more than words ever could. Nia, seeing the wound on his arm, acted on instinct, her fear momentarily forgotten. She tore a strip of fabric from the curtains and, with gentle, steady hands, began to dress the wound. Her touch was a balm, not just to the physical injury, but to the deeper wounds of his soul. In that moment, the power dynamic between them evaporated. They were no longer a captor and his witness, but two people clinging to each other in the wreckage of their lives. Over the next few days, as they remained locked away in the repaired fortress, their fragile bond began to blossom into something deeper, something that felt dangerously like hope. They talked for hours, mostly about Minho. Nia shared stories of his quick wit, his secret passion for poetry, his dream of becoming a writer. She painted a portrait of a young man Jae-wook had been too busy to truly see. He listened, his heart aching with regret, but also filling with a profound gratitude for this woman who had given his son a space to be himself. In return, Jae-wook found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He spoke of his own childhood, of the crushing weight of his father's expectations, of the moment he first held Minho in his arms and swore to build a world that could never hurt him, a promise he had so tragically broken. One evening, he found Nia asleep in an armchair, a book of Minho's resting on her chest. A nightmare flickered across her features, her hands clenching. He knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. Her eyes flew open, wide with panic, but softened when she saw him. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "You're safe," she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of the sanctuary they had found in each other. The air between them grew thick with unspoken feelings, a magnetic pull that was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was no longer just about shared grief. It was about the possibility of a shared future. The final piece of evidence from Midjourney arrived like a death warrant. Encrypted financial records showing massive transfers from company accounts into offshore holdings controlled by Jinwoo. Timestamps on the transfers correlated with meetings Jinwoo had with Kong. It was irrefutable, a cold, hard map of his brother's betrayal. The time for mourning was over. The time for justice had come. Jae-wook arranged a dinner at the family estate, a sprawling, traditional home that stood as a monument to their dynasty. It was a place of ghosts and memories, the perfect stage for the final act of this tragedy. He instructed Nia to stay in the penthouse, safe behind layers of security, but she refused. "I started this with you," she said, her gaze firm, her voice imbued with a strength he had come to admire. "I will see it to the end." He saw the resolve in her eyes and knew that arguing was pointless. She was no longer an outsider. She was a part of this, a part of him. He agreed, a silent promise to protect her hanging between them. The dinner was a masterclass in tension. Jinwoo arrived, his demeanor one of feigned concern, asking after Jae-wook's health, his words like poison-tipped arrows. Jae-wook played his part, the grieving brother, until the last course was cleared. Then, he simply slid a tablet across the polished mahogany table. On the screen, the damning financial records glowed. Jinwoo's face went pale. The mask of civility shattered, revealing the writhing snakes of jealousy and ambition beneath. He was just a boy. Jae-wook's voice was dangerously quiet. "My son," Jinwoo laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Your son. He was always your son, your heir. What was I? A shadow. Your tool. He found out about my plans. My nest egg to finally escape your shadow. He was going to tell you, to ruin me." He forced my hand. The confession hung in the air, ugly and raw. As if on cue, the doors burst open. Kong and his men flooded the room, guns raised, a final, desperate gambit by Jinwoo. But Jae-wook was prepared. Midjourney and his own loyalists emerged from the shadows, and the ornate dining room erupted into a symphony of chaos and gunfire. Jae-wook moved with a singular purpose. He pushed Nia behind him, becoming her shield as he returned fire. In the maelstrom of violence, their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them. This was the end of the old world. In the heat of the battle, Nia saw an opportunity. As a gunman took aim at a distracted Jae-wook, she grabbed a heavy vase and smashed it over the man's head, her action decisive and brave. Jae-wook turned, a look of stunned admiration on his face, before dispatching the man. The fight was brutal but swift. When the smoke cleared, Jinwoo and Kong were subdued, their reign of terror over. Jaewook stood amidst the wreckage of his dining room and his family, not with the triumph of victory, but with the heavy weariness of a war finally ended. The sun rose on a new day, its light spilling across a city that felt irrevocably changed. The immediate threat was gone, the betrayal dealt with in the swift and silent manner of Jaewook's world. But the victory felt hollow, the silence in the penthouse more profound than before. The ghosts of Minho and a lifetime of violence still lingered. A week later, Jaewook and Nia stood before Minho's grave once more. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the weeping gray of their first meeting. They stood not as strangers bound by suspicion, but as two halves of a whole, their shared sorrow having forged a bond stronger than steel. Jaewook placed a single pink rose, Minho's favorite, on the stone. He turned to Nia, his eyes, once so cold and hard, now filled with a vulnerability she was the only one allowed to see. "He brought you to me," Jaewook said, his voice thick with emotion. "In his own way, he saved me. You saved me. You woke me up from a long, dark sleep." He took her hands in his, their warmth a stark contrast to the cold stone of the grave. "This world of mine, it is poison. It took my son. It almost took you. I am offering you a choice, Nia. A way out. I can set you up with a new life, anywhere you want to go, far from here. You can be free of this, and of me." His offer was the greatest act of love he was capable of, the willingness to let her go for her own safety. Nia looked at the handsome, broken man before her, a man who had shown her the deepest darkness and an unexpected, fierce light. She thought of the life he offered, a life of quiet normalcy. But then she thought of the life she would be leaving behind, a life with him. "What if I don't want to be free of you?" she asked softly. "What if my new life is here with you? Not in the world of violence, but in a new one that we build together." Out of the ashes of this 1 inch a slow smile touched Jaewook's lips, a genuine expression of hope that transformed his face. He gently pulled her closer, his hand cupping her cheek. "Then we will build a world worthy of his memory," he whispered, before leaning in and kissing her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation, but one of promise, a seal on a new beginning. As they stood together in the quiet cemetery, they were no longer defined by their grief, but by the love that had grown from it, a resilient, beautiful flower blooming in the most desolate of landscapes. The Mafia boss had found his heart, and the determined outsider had found her home.